Question 118. Miss Pacheco and Mr. Edwards and Mr. Richards are three math teachers at Turner Middle School. Miss Pacheco is 3 years older than Mr. Richards. Mr. Edwards is twice as old as Mr. Richards. And the sum of Mr. Edwards or Richards' age and Mr. Edwards' age is 81. How old is each person? All right, so this is the first time we're going to do a 5D process and just kind of make it out on our paper, but that's how we're going to solve this. So I'm going to go here to this pages, and the first thing that we have to do on our 5D process is we have to do our describe or draw. So top of my paper, I'm going to write down describe, and by now you're used to my sloppy handwriting, so do the best we can. So here is my describe. And I'm going to go back to the question and see what we can put in here. So we know this, that Miss Pacheco, I'm just going to call her Miss P. It tells us that Miss Pacheco is 3 years older than Mr. Richards. So Miss Pacheco, she is this old. I guess we'll put an equal. She is 3 years older than Mr. Richards. So whatever Mr. Richards is, we're going to just call him Mr. R if that's okay. She is 3 years older. So it's Mr. Richards' age plus 3. All right, so that's Miss Pacheco. The next person is, it tells us that, let's see, Miss 3 years older than Mr. Richards. Mr. Edwards. So we have this. So we know that Mr. We'll put E for Edwards. It tells us that Mr. Edwards is twice as old as Mr. Richards. So whatever Mr. Richards is, we are going to multiply that by 2. So Miss Pacheco is 3 years older than Mr. Richards. Mr. Edwards is twice as old as Mr. Richards. And also it tells us that the sum of Mr. Richards and Mr. Edwards' age is 81. So I know this, that whatever Mr. Richards plus, whoops, there's an R, whatever Mr. Richards and Mr. Edwards' age is together, it has to equal 81. All right, so there's my describe statement. Hope I don't run out of room here on my paper. So the next thing we need to set up is our columns. So I'm going to do this. So we have our lines. I'll go all the way across. And my first part is my define. All right. So I am going to do my define. And in my define, this is where our different parts are. So I've got 3 people, Miss Pacheco, Mr. Edwards, and Mr. Richards. So I need 3 different columns. So I've got my first column, that's not very straight, my second column, and my third column for my define. Then I've got my do, which is where we're going to add up Mr. Edwards and Mr. Richards' age. All right. And we know in the decide part of this column, whoops, D-E-C-I-D-E. Now we know I teach math and not language arts. Decide. We know that when we add their ages together, it has to be 81. So let's write that down so we have it. So when I add up Mr. Richards and Mr. Edwards, we need to get to 81. All right. So we've kind of got our 5D process set up. We've got our statements that we need. Miss Pacheco is whatever Mr. Richards is plus 3 years. Mr. Edwards is whatever Mr. Richards is times 2. And Mr. Richards plus Mr. Edwards' age needs to add up to 81. All right, so here's my 3 pieces. So now we got to figure out who do we start with. And so I always say, okay, let's start with the person. If we knew their age, we would know everybody's. which when we set it up like this, it's kind of obvious that Mr. Richards, all right, is the one that we need to know. So I'm going to write that in here. So this is going to be Mr. Richards' column. We're going to make this Miss Pacheco's column. And we're going to make this Mr. Edwards' column. All right. So Richards, Pacheco, Edwards. All right. So Mr. Richards, we just got to take a guess. Boy, I don't even know where to start with this. Let's just start with Mr. Richards as 30. So if Mr. Richards is 30 years old, I'm just pulling this out of the air. I don't even know where to start. Let's see. Mr. Richards is 30. Miss Pacheco is whatever Mr. Richards is plus 3. So that would make that 33. And Mr. Edwards is Mr. Richards times 2. So if I times this by 2, we get 60. All right. Now to see if I'm right, we take Mr. Richards and Mr. Edwards. So Mr. Richards, Mr. Edwards. So these two, 30 and 60. So 30 plus 60 gives me 90. Hey, not too bad though. All right, so we know that this is too high. All right, so we need to go down. Boy, I don't know. Let's go down to 27 for Mr. Richards. So let's see. Miss Pacheco is 3 years older than Mr. Richards. So let's see. 3 years older would make her 30. And we know that Mr. Edwards is Mr. Richards times 2. So 27 times 2. Let's see. That's a 14. That's a 2 there. Carry a 1. That's 54. So that makes him 54. All right. So the due is Mr. Richard and Mr. Edwards' age. So 27 plus 54 is going to give us 27 plus 54. Oh, actually, does that work? Let's make sure. 27. 54. I'm going to get 11. 5 and 2 is 7 plus 1 is 8. Hey, it's 81. All right, whoops. 81. That worked out better than I thought it was going to. Awesome. All right, so yay, we got the right answer. Okay, now we're not finished because we got to do that declare statement. And I'm kind of running out of room here. So you would write down here at the bottom your declare statement. I'm going to write it up top here. And this is going to be my declare statement. And remember what the question was asking us. The question wanted to know the ages of all 3 teachers. So that's what needs to go into our declare statement. So let's see. I know that Miss Pacheco, we know that she is 30 years old. Mr. Edwards, and hopefully you're writing out Edwards. I'm doing it just to save you having to look at my sloppiness. We know that Mr. Edwards is 54. And last but not least, Mr. Richards is 27. So remember, this declare statement has to be done because this is answering the question of what all the teachers are. Hopefully this 5D process is getting easier the more we do it. Describe, write down the important information. Then you got to kind of think about, okay, who's that one person that kind of unlocks everything? And in this one, it was definitely Mr. Richards. So that's my guessing name. And then we just fill in the stuff. All right. Hopefully that helps.